The other thing I want to get to, um, Europe has fallen into Vladimir Putin's trap. Europe has fallen into Vladimir Putin's trap. And this became somewhat clear to me after reading Donald Trump's harebrained, deranged tweet that he put out on Truth Social, ironically named. Just to give some context to this. So Trump puts out this tweet. I know you remember it. It was before he goes to the United Nations and makes an ass out of himself. After getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russian military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it's causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where the war started, it is very much an option. Why not? Russia's been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years of war. They should have taken a real military power less than a week to win. This is not distinguishing Russia. In fact, it is very much making them look like a paper tiger. When the people living in Moscow and all of the great cities, towns, districts throughout Russia find out what's really going on in this war, the fact that it is almost impossible for them to get gasoline through long lines that are being formed, and all other things that are taking place in the war economy, where most of the money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which has great spirit and only getting better. Ukraine will be able to take back their country in its original form. And who knows, maybe even go beyond. Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and it's time for Ukraine. Big economic trouble. Where is it? Right there. And this time for Ukraine to act in any event. I wish both countries well. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what it wants with them. Good luck to all. Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. This tweet has to be one of the most mendacious, harebrained, just complete contradiction to reality that I think I've ever seen, even coming out of Donald Trump. By the same token, though, he makes an interesting point. Even though the point is still nonsense. Just to go through a few of this, because it is important. People looked at this tweet as if Donald Trump had changed his position or is doing something different. The Wall Street Journal points out that Donald Trump is not changing his position. This is just rhetoric. His position remains the same. So there's that. As I pointed out yesterday, the tweet is not just non-committal. The tweet offloads all of this onto Europe. When he says, in any case, I wish both countries well, we'll continue to supply weapons to NATO. I mean, you can continue to buy weapons to us, but this is really Europe's thing. I think Europe can fund this war. Europe can effectively give them money for them to take their entire country back. Okay, well, even that's nonsense. Zelensky himself has pointed out that they don't have the power to take Ukraine back. Don't take my word for it, take Zelensky's. I don't know why Trump thinks otherwise. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. If he does, he's magnificently uninformed. But Zelensky could have told him, we don't have the capability to do that, because Zelensky has already said we don't have the capability to do that. On the other front, on the economic front, Russia in 2023 was at 4.1% economic growth. 2024, 4.3% economic growth. And this year, they're forecasting 2.1% after making some kind of moves and everything else to kind of calm down the economy for reasons of inflation. That is the fastest growing economy in Europe. And if I'm not mistaken, the United States may hit that number. But if you remember, Jerome Powell has just dropped interest rates because he's trying to fight off with every inch of fiber in his body a recession that he believes, and many people believe, is on the horizon. Add to that the dollar that's been dropping in value and inflation that has been increasing the cost of things, meaning Americans are paying more because the dollar is weaker and because of the things that Donald Trump has been doing, this Trump economy, everything costs more. The Russian economy is fine. Our economy, the European economies, on the other hand, that's a bit different. The UK and France, screaming headlines. Oh my God, We may need an IMF loan because their finances are in the gutter. If you look at Germany right now, Germany has been doing mass layoffs because, after all, their basis of their economy was getting cheap energy. The US blew up the pipeline. And so they've been spending more money for energy in a way that their companies couldn't necessarily compensate. So they have been in a recession and have been cutting jobs to an insane degree. Starmer is hated. Merz, hated. Meaning the Russian economy is doing fine, especially in comparison to the European economies. I don't know what Donald Trump is talking about. I don't know who misinformed him. That's assuming he's just not lying. Habitual liars lie. So there is that. Add to that, there were $37 trillion in debt. That's amazing. And that number will go up after the midterms because Donald Trump effectively pushed the big expenditures to after the midterms because he didn't want the consequences to be felt before the election. So there is that. As for a real military being able to do X or Y, the United States, with $1 trillion military budget, ships, planes, nuclear missiles, went up against Yemen and lost. We lost. Donald Trump is begging Afghanistan to get back into Bagram Air Base because we lost. I hope you get my point on this. Russia is fighting a near-peer competitor in a war that brings up an interesting question nonetheless. Meaning, Donald Trump is effectively saying, you should be able to do this in a few days. Well, that's nonsense. But there's a question that is being pressed. Why is this taking so long? Right? And obviously, from the Russian point of view, they have nukes, Orezhniks, missiles called Satan. If they wanted to turn Ukraine into Gaza, they could do it. They choose not to. Every breath that Zelensky takes is a blessing from Vladimir Putin. And yet, the war drags on, slow, inexorably going westward, but drags on nonetheless, and it's dragged on for 3 years. This is strategy at work. Now, Zelensky apparently, in the Wall Street Journal article, went to Trump and said, hey, we're planning another offensive. And when I hear that, I'm like, do it. Because if you remember how the last offensive turned out, Zelensky got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people killed in that offensive. And so if he's planning another one, I have no reason to expect the results won't turn out like they were before. But therein lies the rub. Zelensky is fighting a different war. You must understand, from the Ukrainian perspective, their very existence hinges on getting money and weapons from other countries in order for them to continue the war. That is the only way they can prosecute the war. They can't do it on their own. So right now, there's a budget crisis that is going on with Ukraine. They don't have the necessary weapons to keep going. They don't have the manpower to keep going, meaning they're getting weaker and weaker every moment, every syllable that comes out of my mouth. There's another Ukrainian that dies, and the Ukrainian military gets weaker even that much more. But Zelensky has a different problem beyond the war, the kinetic war. One of the problems that he has is he has to present an image that something is happening that is to the benefit of Ukraine. Because what you don't want is countries to think this war is done, you've lost, and I don't want to sink bad money or good money after bad. So you need to show, let's have a Kursk offensive. Let's have some other new offensive. Let's attack in this particular way. Oh, here's a drone that flies and hits Moscow. You need to do those things. They're theatrical. They're not necessarily doing anything in the context of the real war that's taking place, where people are getting killed and they're being pushed back day after day. But again, you're fighting a different war. The propaganda of that war matters. And in some cases, you can make an argument that the propaganda is the thing that has allowed Zelensky to continue going as is. There's more to it than that. I mean, obviously, Europe and NATO don't want to look like an asshole for losing after spending, 70 years preparing for a war with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapses. The remnant, the beating heart of the Soviet Union is left, and it puts a killing on the proxy army, largest army in Europe, at least it was at one point, that was put against Russia. So yeah, there's that. But part of Zelensky's job is to show that something is happening, whether it's real or imagined. So I hope you get my point. Many of the things that Zelensky was doing wasn't necessarily the best militarily, but it was done purely for propagandistic effect because he needed the money to keep going. He needed the weapons to keep going. He needed to be a confidence guy so he can tell the Western media, hey, 200,000 Russians have died and we've only lost 8,000. It's like, wow, that's pretty interesting considering the cemeteries filled up. So there's that. I just want to make that clear. Zelensky has been fighting a different war. Even when it's to the detriment of his own soldiers, he has been fighting a different war. And part of this also has to do with the Europeans and the United States. The information that they do or push Zelensky to do often has been getting their people killed. Kursk offensive, for example, Krinky is another one where the British pushed them and they lost thousands of people in that campaign. There's a difference between, let's say, the United States prosecuting a war, Americans die, and the American public has feelings about the fact that Americans die and puts pressure on the government to stop that war, let's say Iraq or let's say Vietnam. It is different when it's not Americans. It is the Ukrainians, because you don't care about the Ukrainians. They're pursuing an end that you want them to pursue. There's a difference in those things. So yes, we will send them and say, hey, you should do this battleground tactic. You should invade in this particular location. You should do this, or you should do that, without real concern about the loss of life, because those lives are not attached to our country in a way that they would be attached if indeed we were the ones that were prosecuting the war. The typical feedback mechanism that's there is not there in this case. And so you can waste a lot of Ukrainian lives without any backlash from the public, either in Europe or in the US. And that is exactly what they have been doing. There's a reason people say to the last dead Ukrainian, because they mean to the last dead Ukrainian. The other part to this I want to point out is that obviously Russia has the capacity to decimate Ukraine if that's indeed what they wanted to do. Now, they call it a special military operation, and apparently Russians are more legalistic in the way that they think about this stuff, so they've kept it somewhat isolated. And I guess there are multiple reasons for that. Obviously, they have Oreshniks. Obviously, they have nuclear missiles. Obviously, they have, hell, Russia, you may not know this, has another 300,000 army, pristine, rested, new equipment, waiting in the background, not being used. If they wanted to press the advantage, they could press the advantage. They're choosing to do it. There's purpose built into it, meaning this is not an issue of capacity. This is an issue of intent. They're purposefully taking on a strategy of slow moving, inexorable progress, like a lava flow. And the question becomes, why? Right? That is an interesting question. And I guess you can break it down into a few potentials. But I think, well, one, Putin doesn't necessarily want to take any kind of major provocative action that may have ontological shock, in which NATO, in fact, gets into a third world war. There's that. The second one is Putin, as Mark would say, likes diplomacy and may still be holding out the shred of hope that at some point there will be some kind of deal, or at the very least that they would accept the surrender document. I don't think that's going to happen, maybe, but that could be possible given Putin's track record on chasing safety and wanting this war to end. The third point is to damage the fiscal, economic, and credibility politically of the European Union, NATO, and the United States. And what I mean by that is, the longer this war dragged out, if you've noticed, is Europe getting weaker or stronger in this? They're getting weaker. As I pointed out, Germany is losing all of those jobs. Europe is in a financial crisis at this point. France, the government literally just collapsed last week with calls to effectively get rid of Macron. The AfD is surging in Germany, often considered a Nazi party, but surging, who are very skeptical of the war. The National Rally, surging in France, with Marie Le Pen, if not Marie Le Pen, one of her upstarts, potentially taking that seat of the presidency in 2027. They had to go through extraordinary action to get rid of Carlin Gorgescu in Romania, who was very skeptical of NATO also. I'm saying that these are political moves that are taking place as the war continues. And the longer the war goes on, this is not a situation of Europe's economic health getting better. Donald Trump is charging Europe a 10% premium on the weapons that they buy. On top of that, he's getting a deal, or at the very least believes he has a deal, where they're going to buy hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons from the United States with the idea of using in Ukraine. But think about what that means. A, you're paying 5 times more for oil or gas or energy because you're not getting it directly from the Russians in the way you were before. So you're buying it from Americans with a massive upcharge. You're also still buying Russian oil. You're just getting it from a third-party vendor, in which case you are also paying a massive upcharge. And now you're also buying weapons from the United States, which means you have money out of these bankrupt countries flooding out of Europe, and has been doing so for the last 3 years. Is that to the betterment of Europe or to the detriment of Europe? And when Mertz and some of these other leaders come in and says, we need to cut back on benefits that you guys are having in these various countries, while simultaneously saying we also need to send hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine. Do you think the public is going to accept that? Meaning you're asking them to accept the unacceptable, that for all intents and purposes, you need to suffer for the benefit of Ukraine. And I will tell you, human beings don't tend to do that. You tend to need a much better reason than saying, rando country that we overthrew and got into a war, and now that we've been spending hundreds of billions of dollars on, and we're in economic shambles, we need you to take cold showers from here on out because #reasons. Good luck with that. Does that create political stability, or does that create political chaos? And obviously, looking at what's taking place in Europe, hell, look at what's taking place in Italy. I know it's on Gaza, but obviously they are tearing that place up. France, the protests that were taking place. And again, the government just collapsed. Germany and the massive layoffs. I'm pointing out that this is not a picture of stability. This is a picture of instability that is being driven in large part by a war that just drags on and drags on and drags on. My argument that I'm trying to make is that Putin is fighting 2 wars. And one war is kinetic, it's direct. It's the war that you see every day where they're sending drones in to kill people, they're bombing, they're shooting Ukrainians in the face. Russians are dying, Ukrainians are dying, but obviously 1.7 million Ukrainians being dead or missing is an astonishing number. That's kinetic war. That's real war. Russia's job is to effectively eliminate as many Ukrainian soldiers, demilitarize Ukraine, and they are doing that with every Banderite that gets shot in the face, or every poor son of a gun that got press ganged into the military that also gets thrown into the Russian wood chipper. But he's also fighting a second war. And I guess my argument is the second war is against Europe itself. I would wager to you that Putin assumes that Europe will get involved in this war. And because he assumes that they're going to get involved in the war, yes, that's World War III. But based on that assumption, there's also a secondary assumption that goes into it, whereas every vehicle, every tank, every drone, every air defense system, every one of those things that gets destroyed is one of those things that they can't use in a war against us. Meaning, it's very possible that they've come to the assessment that it's better to destroy Europe and America's equipment in Ukraine as opposed to having to deal with that on the battlefield in a later war. Also, the longer this rumbles on, the further out that date for that Third World War where Europe feels like it needs to get involved. So you're effectively expanding the playing field. You're expanding in this kind of temporal way the amount of time that Ukraine still remains standing, and the amount of time that Europe has to support that Ukraine as it remains standing, despite the fact that it's getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And it's clear that they've effectively lost this war, but Russia hasn't necessarily taken overt aggressive action to put it into it. I think that's on purpose. I think the goal is we will be fighting Europe at some point, damage them financially, politically, and maybe there is even a chance that if their political change because of the economic damage that takes place, you may not have to fight them at all. If you can expand the date, if you could push the war out, if you could drag the war on, the longer it goes, the weaker Europe gets. And maybe they get to the point where there's political change that prevents them fighting that war at all. I think this is grand strategy at work. I don't think this is haphazard. I think Russia realizes that there is a third world war that is on the horizon. And that even what Europe is doing right now, where they're, oh my God, Russia invaded Estonian airspace. Oh my God, there was a drone that flew into Poland. Oh my God, the Russians keep agitating against us. All of this is a pretext or setting a pretext for war later on. My assessment or my point of view is that Europe most likely will have to get involved in the war just before Ukraine drops. If you go into a war after they drop, then you don't necessarily have the muscle that might be there, even if it's fledgling. You at the very least have something that's there. Europe also, I strongly suspect, assumes, or at the very least believes, that Donald Trump will get into the war. And the reason why I say that is they have been begging the United States for a backstop this entire way through. Okay, well, why are you begging the U.S. for a backstop? You're begging them for a backstop because you know that your people will get eaten alive. And so the people, the poor bastards that they put in initially will purely be used as a tripwire. The cynical Europeans will use them as chum in the water. And when the Russians kill them, they will scream bloody murder, and they would go to Donald Trump, trying to put all sorts of pressure to get America into the war to make it an official third world war. Now, if you have different leadership, if there's political chaos, if there's economic chaos, will the public go gently into that wood chipper? Meaning, you could even have a situation where the public is so against what is taking place and is so angry at the government that this idea of them being able to prosecute this plan fails. If you pursue an objective to end the war immediately or quickly, that's no longer the case. I could be wrong. But that's my thinking on it. When Donald Trump pointed out, well, real military could have done so-and-so. Okay, well, that's nonsense. You're fighting a near-peer competitor. Russia went in with 150,000 men against a Ukrainian military that was like 1 million men strong. And they still were able to take 20% of the territory. So understand the context that we are effectively talking about. That was then, however. This is now with 400,000, if not more, people who deserted the Ukrainian military, with them dragging and snatching delivery people and people walking their dogs off the streets and throwing them into a meat grinder. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the military capacity. And one last point. There's a contradiction in the way that this is operating. The United States, under Donald Trump, wants Europe to buy weapons from the United States. For him, it's a business issue. Hey, we can sell you all of this weapons. We can make all of this money on these weapons. But the problem with that is if you're indeed gearing up for a third world war, your industrial capacity needs to be able to match the war and the intensity of that war. It has become clear as a bell that the United States does not have the military capacity in the way that it did, let's say, in the 60s or 40s. And so you're selling them weapons that they won't get for years. And yet you're still agitating for war, even to the point of saying, Europe, have at it. You can handle the Russians. We're out. Now, obviously, he's not out. The United States leads NATO. We put 16% into NATO. And so we're still buying weapons, regardless of what Donald Trump is effectively saying. But I'm trying to make the point that Europe is taking a particular posture where it's buying weapons that it won't get until the future without building its own military capacity, because the United States, all things being equal, is not going to want to rival in military armaments and selling of those armaments. So whereas Russia is producing this stuff hand over fist and is preparing for a later date of a war, Europe is waiting on weapons from America, with America not being able to supply, let's say, the air defense systems, etc., that will be required for a major war. Those things are getting blown up in Ukraine. And if you notice, what the US has been doing is saying, hey, Netherlands, give Ukraine your air defense. Hey, Germany, give Ukraine your air defense. Meaning they're moving equipment around, not necessarily producing equipment at the speed and at the degree that you would need for a large-scale war. And yet, they're still doing false flags in order to create a pretext to try to say, look, Trump, look at the bad Russians and what they've been doing in Europe, with hopes that A, Daddy will pay attention, and B, at the point where they actually provoke a false flag, where they try to declare Article 5, this will probably be the moment that Ukraine is on the brink of collapse, that Trump will get involved. That is a heavy gamble. That is a heavy gamble. I agree that there's going to be all sorts of pressure that's on Trump. But that is the ultimate wager. Europe knows that it is in no capacity to fight the Russians. If Ukraine can do it, Europe damn sure can't do it. To give an example, those drones that had no missile system, they were just dummy drones. They had to take F-35s to fly and try to shoot down a dummy drone. A missile from Netherlands, missile from Poland landed on houses in Poland, to which they tried to blame the Russians, only a day later having to come on and saying, okay, our bad, this was our missile, we're idiots. I'm saying that the reason that Russia is slow rolling this is in part, you don't want to kill a lot of people, so there's that. And I suspect it's all three, but I'm leaning heavily on this idea of we're not in a rush, our economy is fine, their economies are tanking, we have new partners, so we can pivot to India, China, etc. If Europe doesn't buy our oil, fair enough, no issue, we're pivoting to Asia. We're good. They're not. They're suffering economically. We're not. What's the rush? I could be wrong. Never mistaken something that's coherent for something that's true. But in this case, Trump, in a backhanded way, does bring up the interesting point. Why is this taking so long? And I guess from my point of view, it's taking so long out of purpose and out of dealing with a threat that is going to take place in the future and trying to deal with that threat now while you're also in this kinetic war with Ukraine. That is my thoughts. I could be wrong, of course. I don't know if I'm wrong. I could be. And separate from the monologue, they are dealing with a near peer competitor. So it's not like the US going after Iraq. You're dealing with a country that has all the support of all of NATO countries, Japan, South Korea combined, in regards to the weapons that are being supplied, the money that is given, etc. If it wasn't for that, Ukraine would have collapsed by now. So this is not a cakewalk. It is an actual war. And it's a war where Russia has effectively put men in gloves with one arm tied behind their back for various reasons, part of which is I take them at their word that they don't necessarily want to kill the civilian population in the way that the US would do if it was running a bombing campaign or running a war. So that is my thoughts. That is where I'm going with that. But the idea that Ukraine can take territory back is nonsense. Nobody can look at what's taking place on the battlefield day by day and come to that assessment. And by the way, Dmitry Medvedev, always colorful, comes out and says this. The Kiev drug addict said the Kremlin should know where a bomb shelter is so its occupants can hide when they use long-range American weapons. What that freak needs to know is that Russia can use weapons and bomb shelters won't protect against. America shall also keep this in mind. I wish he would have said, thank you for listening. Now, what he means by that, and the reason that he's pointing that out, in this article by the Wall Street Journal, they point out, I don't think it's this article, Zelensky said it a lot. Zelensky, when he was in an interview, pointed out, well, America is thinking about letting me use long-range missiles. Now, the Wall Street Journal reports that Trump has still ruled out Zelensky using long-range American weapons in Russia. And for all intents and purposes, Zelensky, even though he may still get weapons from America, is limited in the use of some of those weapons in the capacity of hitting Russian cities. What Dmitry Medvedev is pointing out after Zelensky's interview was Zelensky said, well, yeah, Donald Trump is thinking about it. He's like, dude, the very breath in your lungs is a gift from Vladimir Putin. If you indeed hit a Russian city with a missile, your life is forfeit. And no bomb shelter is going to protect you from it. Which goes back to my main point in the article. If the Russians wanted to take out decision-making centers, they could do that. They have the inventory to do that. If they wanted to go after Zelensky, they could do that. They choose not to do these things. If they wanted to decimate cities and make them look like Gaza, they could do that. They choose not to do those things. And so when they say we need to demilitarize Ukraine, they are specifically keeping it to military targets and, for that matter, to soldiers. We're not trying to destroy all of this stuff, infrastructure and everything else. Demilitarize. Kill one Ukrainian after the next. We're not hitting decision-making centers. We're not going to overwhelm Kiev. We're not going to take down apartment buildings. We're not going to just go scorched earth. That is not what we want to do. We choose to do something different. We choose to fight the war in the way that we're fighting the war. And I think it's an interesting question as why they're doing it. Dmitry Medvedev makes my point. It's like, dude, the very air you breathe is a gift. The very air you breathe is a gift. Another story that, what time is it? Yeah, we have time. Ray McGovern is coming up at 15. That I don't know how to place the story. So Iran, let's say Iranian intelligence, somehow hacked or got their hands on confidential documents that show that the IAEA was being spied on, Grossi specifically, by Israel. They also, in their documentation that they're putting out, is showing the nuclear sites in Israel itself in these documents. This is what they put out. And again, I don't quite know how to place this, but and it's not helping the
هرچند رژیم آمریکا با اختلاف بزرگترین حامی بمب اتم صهیونیست هاست، اما کمیسیون اتمی رژیم با اروپایی ها هم برنامه‌های متنوعی دارد. رژیم